So I'm sure you've heard about the Japanese earthquake and the other one recently, and there's a whole swarm of them in Japan, literally like going across the country, like literally, remember when you were a kid? Please cut out the dotted lines in the following picture. That dotted line is like the middle of Japan of earthquake swarms. Now, Webbot did say, get ready for some, earthquake news, so to speak. And these things happened after the Webbot report came out. I will note that. But I want to read you this from Silver Dockers about this quake. I'm going to show you a picture, and then I want to talk about, for a minute, the sleeping prophet, as he was called, Edgar Cayce, one of my favorite of those types of people, mediums or psychics, whatever, not really a medium. Well, I guess he kind of was, because he would go into a trance and speaks from somebody, somebody was speaking for him. Incredible stories from Edgar Cayce. But he does mention Japan and a big problem for Japan. Now, granted, he died, I think, in 1943 or 44, which he prophesied, just like Nostradamus did. The day he would die, he was spot on. We'll get to that in a minute. Dozens of large earthquakes strike as speculation mounts that Japan's southern island may split. I believe that we have entered a period of time during which we will see seismic activity on a scale that none of us ever experienced before. This great shaking will combine with other factors such as financial collapse, geopolitical instability, and civil unrest to produce what many have described as a perfect storm, submitted by Michael Snyder. Over the past 48 hours, our planet has been hit by literally dozens of earthquakes of magnitude 4 or greater. And by the way, I've looked at, years ago anyways, USGS data, earthquake data, and you could look every single day. A 4.0 earthquake, not uncommon at all. I mean, completely not. So I will say that. These bigger ones, 7 point plus, whatever, those are not so common. So we've been hit with dozens of earthquakes of magnitude 4.0 or greater, and scientists are acknowledging that what is taking place is highly unusual. I also want to mention Dr. La Violette and his theory called superwave theory, in which we would see earthquakes picking up steam as this superwave from the center of the galaxy hits Earth. And as Earth does this around the galaxy, our solar system does, when we line up perfectly with it, there's some kind of energy wave. And as we get closer and closer and closer and closer to that energy wave, and it's always beaming out, I guess, problems start happening on Earth, according to his theory. It's just a theory. We'll get into that too. So it says this is strange. The strange shaking began toward the end of last week when the globe was struck by 5 major earthquakes over the span of just 2 days. And over the weekend, the seismic activity just continued to escalate. Very early on Saturday, Japan's southern island of Cayce was hit by a magnitude 7.3 earthquake, and on Saturday night, a 7.8 struck off the coast of Ecuador's, its Pacific coast. That was the other country I was thinking of the other day when I mentioned this. It was the worst earthquake that Ecuador had experienced since 1979, and it was followed by at least 163 aftershocks. Unfortunately, there are indications that what we have seen so far may just be the beginning. Because the Ecuador earthquake was bigger, it is getting most of the headlines at the moment, but the truth is that what is going on in Japan is potentially far more dangerous. Over the past week, Japan's southern island of Cayce has been rocked by a series of devastating quakes, including 2 major ones in less than 48 hours. The following is from The Guardian. A second major earthquake in less than 2 days has shaken Japan's southern island of Cayce, with at least 34 people thought to have been killed and about 1,500 injured and more feared buried after building collapses and landslides. The 7.3 magnitude quake struck at about 1:30 a.m. on Saturday, waking people across the island, including the thousands already in crisis centers. It caused widespread damage, with several landslides and a village evacuated over fears of a dam being burst. I'm going to just mention something here. Webbot. This is an older report, but it was very clear. Something along the lines of a big earthquake type of event happening and a dam being caught over near it or on it or whatever, bursting, and floods going epically out of control. Just unbelievable. And it would lead to something like, if I recall correctly, it will have traveled 1,000 miles, the water. Not necessarily flooding all the way down, but it will have bridges collapsing for 1,000 miles. There'll be at least damage, not necessarily collapsing, but damage to bridges 1,000 miles. Now, I thought, if I remember correctly, that this was specific to the United States in that forecast. And I know we've had our eyes on the Hoover Dam for a while. There are some serious, like, satanic statues and weird things. There's been hints in movies. You know, the club likes to put stuff in movies about that dam bursting. If you look at the $50 bill, I think, or is it the $100 bill? You fold it just like you fold the other ones that showed 9/11 in advance. Again, the club likes to put stuff right in front of your face. And it shows literally the Hoover Dam bursting. You can't tell me, well, that's just a chance. You flipped a dollar or $50 bill and it shows the Hoover Dam bursting. Like, it's the same layout. So I think that's on the club's radar. And again, like it just said, if we have economic problems, an earthquake problem, all these things, they hate to hit us all at once. Talk about the perfect excuse to blow up the world economy. Blame it on the weather. Blame it on the rain. Rain's not going to be good enough. Blame it on Hoover Dam. Yeah. Now that would work. Yes, it would. So I think we're in for quite an interesting time. This particular map is showing this part of Japan or whatever. Let me switch this real quick so you can take a peek at that. Here's the swarm of quakes, like literally cutting it in half. And I want to go to Edgar Cayce now. Just a couple paragraphs. Edgar Cayce predicted that dramatic physical changes would affect the Earth in the years from 1959 to 1998, and it would begin with the eruption of Mount Etna. The Great Lakes would empty into the Gulf of Mexico, linked with a time when ancient repositories would be discovered as people reached the appropriate level of consciousness. The three repositories mentioned are Egypt, the Bimini area, and the Yucatan. After activities by Mount Vesuvius, Mount Pelee, the south coast of California, the areas between Great Salt Lake and the southern portions of Nevada, we may expect, within the 3 months following, inundation by earthquakes, more in the southern area than the northern hemisphere. Portions of the New York or New York City itself will disappear, as well as the southern portions of Georgia and Carolina. Land will appear in the Atlantic and Pacific, rising of Atlantis, and what is the coastline now of many a land will be the bed of the ocean. Even many battlefields of the present will become oceans, seas, the bays, the lands over which the New World Order will carry on their trade as one with another. The waters, now I don't know did he actually use the word New World Order? I mean, it's in here. And it's in there. The waters of the lakes will empty into the Gulf. It would be well if the waterway were prepared, but not for the purpose for which it is at present being considered. Then the area where I am now located, Virginia Beach, will be among the safety lands, as will be portions of what is now Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, and much of the southern portion of Canada and the eastern portion of Canada, while the west land, much of that is to be disturbed, as, of course, much in other lands. The greater portion of Japan must go into the sea. The upper portion of Europe will be changed as in the twinkling of an eye. When there is the first breaking up of some conditions in the South Sea, and those are apparent in the sinking or rising of that's almost opposite same, or in the Mediterranean, in the Etna area, then we may know it has begun. There will be the upheavals in the Arctic and in the Antarctic that will make for the eruption of volcanoes in the torrid areas and there will be the shifting then of the poles. When there has been those of a frigid or the semi-tropical, where there has been those of a frigid or the semi-tropical will become the more tropical, and moss and fern will grow. So clearly, the weather patterns and where it used to get cold, it's not going to be so cold. It's going to shift. I'm assuming that's part of a pole shift. That doesn't necessarily mean the Earth is flipping. It just means the poles. And he also said, which he doesn't say here on this particular page I'm reading, he said that the North Pole would travel in, I forget what name he gave it, but I remember following that years ago. And sure enough, it's like, well, how long has the North Pole been slowly moving? And it's like, well, it started back in 100 years ago, and then it was just barely creeping. And then as we got to 1980, it started picking up speed. 2000, picking up even more speed. 2010, it's even faster, going to some part of the world in or near Russia, if I recall. And he said that would be where the new North Pole is. And by God, that's exactly where it's heading. He said this stuff clearly before 1944 when he died. So the only other thing I'm thinking of is Dr. La Violette. And he's got an interview that he did years ago with Project Camelot. And just look it up on YouTube. Superwave theory. It's about an hour and a half or 2 hours long. It's just him being interviewed. It's really interesting. He has some really incredible theories. He mentioned some things he came up with first before other scientists, came up with, like in the 80s, and they just figured it out not that long ago, kind of a thing. So, pretty interesting guy. But he has this theory that this gravitational wave is coming, this certain, or superwave as he calls it, and it would be preceded by a gravitational wave that would cause disruptions on Earth, such as earthquake activity and volcanoes and that kind of thing going off. That would be like the knock on the door saying, hey, it's coming. He says, I don't know if it was the North Pole or the South Pole, wherever he was, but he was able to study ice core samples. There was another team of scientists already up there studying super long ice core samples that went hundreds of thousands of years. I mean, maybe even millions of years. He says it in the interview. And he says, so I kind of got the scraps of those, which was still enough for maybe a couple 100,000 years or something. Again, he says it in the video. I don't remember the exact amount of time that covered. And he says you could see these, pure white ice cores, and all the way down, you would see these like three little rings, and then kind of clearly spaced out, like almost like, like a pretty cyclical, like, that goes on for, there's 50,000 years, 100,000 years, 200,000. Wow, they're still there. And he's determined, again, by measuring the ice core samples, because every year it's like a tree ring. You know how as a tree grows, if you cut the tree and you count the rings, that's how old the tree is or whatever? Same thing applies to these ice core samples. So they're checking them out, and he's like, okay, well, that's like, around 3,000 years, and that one's 11,000 years, and this other one's 26,000 years, or maybe it was 5,000 years and 11,000, and then 26,000 or something like that. And I said, and people were like, well, hold on, isn't that, 5,125 years, the time it takes the Earth to, I guess, go around, make a complete cycle around the Milky Way or whatever the hell it is, or not around it, but we go up in a sine wave around, as we spin around the Milky Way, sine wave pattern. The center is where this wave is, let's call it, but as we go up to the top and then to the bottom, that's 26,000 years. So he was saying you could kind of space this out. One of the rings is every 26,000 years, and it's also was there at the halfway point, which I guess was 13,000 years, so it was on its way up and on its way down or whatever. And then there was another one that was, again, I think it was like 5,000 years. And the lady interviewing him was like, well, wait a minute, isn't the mind counter stuff, and isn't there a cycle that the mind's counted that was 5,125 years? And he was like, well, yeah, actually there is. And she says, well, the year 2012 is coming up. I'm sure you heard about that in the mind calendar. Yes, I have. So these things are kind of written in this ice core sample, yeah? And if they're measured, where are we at now? When's the next one due? He says, it's already due right now. Any day, any time. He says, but I'll tell you, there's an error of margin, margin of error and it's about 400 years, just due to, again, our top of the line technical skills, equipment of this day. It's as good as it can get. It's, going back hundreds of thousands of years. It could be off by 400 years, he said. So again, being that the margin's there, we're ready for one. So again, Mayan calendar did end in 2012. Doesn't mean on the stroke of midnight, right? I mean, is it that perfect? Obviously not. But as I've been saying all these years after 2012, I've been noticing the earthquake activity, volcanic activity. It's been steadily getting worse. And like I talk about everything, I said that everything has a cycle. You plant a seed, it grows up, it dies off, goes. People, we born, we live up, die. Everything's a cycle. Which also means everything has a peak at some point, right? Oh, you've reached your peak or whatever, right? Everything has its peak. And we ain't seen the peak yet. These volcanoes and stuff, they're just getting worse and worse and more frequently, happening more frequently. Therefore, one can safely say we haven't peaked yet. So he's got ice core samples saying whatever, and again, these little rings I'm talking about, there was these dark spots. And he mentions what it is and what these dark spots contain. Again, it's too long ago for me to remember now, but he says we know this comes basically from like space, this particular particle or whatever. So all I know is that the Earth gets kind of bombarded by these particles in these given time spans. Sometimes the rings are quite dark, meaning it was quite severe of this particle ever coming in down to Earth. And she asked, like, is it always one of those rings, like every 26,000 year one? And he said, no, it actually varied. It might be the 13,000 one, it might be the 5,000 year one, it might be the 26,000 one. There was no rhyme or reason for that. He couldn't pick up any pattern other than these three specific patterns that there's some of it. There's always some there. Sometimes it's worse, sometimes it's not. Therefore, you couldn't possibly calculate if this next one's going to be a worse one. It's not possible. So it was a really, really fascinating interview. I just remember that so much because it was so interesting. I recommend you find it. Again, Superwave Theory, Dr. La Violette. Or just type in Project Camelot into YouTube, Superwave Theory. Project Camelot, Superwave Theory. Interesting times. Take care.